Hi there, and welcome to Steps Together, the Steps for Development podcast, where we come together to learn and build our own skills so we can help the children in our lives to thrive and succeed. I'm your host, Deb Johnson, and I'm really glad you're here today. No matter what role you have in a child's life, whether you're a parent or an educator, whether you're a child care provider, maybe you're a healthcare professional like me, maybe you just have children in your family or neighbors where children are struggling or are neurodivergent and presenting as different, right? You're just not sure what to do. Well, you've come to the right place. As an occupational therapist, I started this podcast to help people like you better understand children, better understand development, and learn practical strategies that help kids every day. On today's episode, I want to talk about when kids don't listen. This is a common complaint. I get this a lot from parents, educators, anywhere adults are with kids. There is probably going to be an adult who says to me, they just don't listen. She never listens to me. He does not listen to a word I say. These are some of the things I hear adults say. So my response to them is, tell me what that looks like. What do you mean when you say they don't listen? Sometimes the adult will say, well, I tell them to do something and they just don't do it. And then I get a sense that what they mean is that the children don't obey. They don't comply with the demand, if you will. So that's one way to interpret they don't listen. Another way people use it is to say that children are not following the directions. Like they'll say, I told them to go get their backpack and their shoes, and they went up to their room and disappeared and came down with their coat, but no shoes or backpack. And so what they mean is they didn't comply, but they're also referring to they didn't follow my directions, right? They kind of listened. They went upstairs. They got something. They came down with a coat, but they didn't really follow the directions. Other times parents will say, I can talk and talk and talk, and he acts like I'm just not even there. And they'll talk about the child ignoring them, that the child doesn't respond. Well, that's a little bit of a different problem if the child isn't responding when you're talking to them. And then there's times when parents will say, well, I tell them what they need to do, and they will sometimes say, sure, okay, mom, okay, dad. And then they go and do whatever they want. They don't listen. They're doing something, but they're not doing what I want. So I think it's very, very important for us as adults to reflect on what do we mean when we say they don't listen? And when we say they're not listening, is it always the same in every situation, or does it change? Because sometimes maybe in the morning they didn't listen for getting their backpack and their shoes, and that is a following direction thing. Maybe later in the day, they didn't listen because you told them to take out the garbage and they didn't do it. And that's a compliance issue, right? They didn't do what you said you wanted done. Maybe later in the day, they were busy playing on their video games and you were trying to call them for dinner and they just didn't respond. Well, that's a different reason for not listening, right? And then maybe you told them to go do their homework and they said, okay, and they went up to their room. And when you got up there, they were building with Legos or, playing on their video games. So they were just doing whatever they wanted. They were not doing what they were supposed to do. So I want you to pay attention for the next few days, maybe the next week until the next podcast comes out. Pay attention to what exactly do you mean and what exactly is their response, right? And then I want you to think about some of these reasons why children are not listening. So when it comes to kids who just do whatever they want, I find that a lot of times that's because they are strong-willed children. They have a mind of their own. They come up with their own ideas. They are very what I call self-directed. And so for you to give them a direction and tell them to do something that they are not intrinsically motivated for, they didn't come up with the idea, um, they don't have any interest in it, right? Like, who cares? I don't care if the garbage goes out or not. It doesn't affect me as a 8-year-old kid. I just want to play on my video games. Um, you may be dealing with a strong-willed personality. However, you might also be dealing with executive function skills. Maybe there are some impairments in attention, whether that is sustained attention or shifting attention or being able to divide attention. Um, those kinds of skills. Maybe it has to do with the executive function skills of being able to plan and organize. If a child doesn't listen to go clean their room, maybe that's because the task of cleaning their room is just overwhelming. There are so many steps, and I don't even know where to start. So it's not so much that they're not listening, they're not trying to be defiant, they just don't have those planning and organizing and sequencing skills to do what you ask them to do. Another reason they might not listen, and maybe why they're not responding when you talk to them, could be an issue with auditory processing or language processing, or just simply their hearing. A lot of times we forget to check, and children who have normal hearing could potentially have a history of ear infections and fluid in the ear. We absolutely need to rule that out if a child does not appear to be hearing us. And then beyond that, just, which having fluid in your ears or not being able to hear means that the words, right, the sounds are not getting into the brain. But once they get into the brain, then the brain needs to process that language. So the ideas of the skills of auditory processing and language processing come into play. Maybe they don't understand the language. That's going to require a speech language pathologist to do a comprehensive evaluation to determine if there's potentially that issue. Maybe your child has motor planning problems, right? In OT, we call this praxis, being able to plan and sequence and organize and execute what we want to do using our body. But there's a form of praxis that is challenging, where it's challenging for the child to translate language into movement. So these children, you can often spot these kids because you give them a verbal direction and they can't follow it with movement. So for example, we have these flat scooter boards, right? The kind that are at the schools. We have those in OT. And a child with a motor planning problem, if I ask them to have a seat, sit down on the scooter, if they've never sat on the scooter, they might not be able to translate that. And maybe what they're familiar with is laying on their belly to pull themselves on the scooter. So that's what they do. They don't sit on the scooter. And it may be that they can't translate the words sit on the scooter to what that movement looks like to actually physically sit on the scooter. So their body just does what they know, which is to lay on their tummy on the scooter. And then the last reason that children might not listen in any particular situation is because they're in an elevated state of dysregulation. They're in a limbic system response. If you caught my last episode, I talked a lot about dysregulation and I talked about the limbic system. So some children live in a heightened limbic system state. And it's very important to recognize that if the child is dealing with this like elevated threat level, right? Their nervous system is on DEFCON 3 all the time, then they're not in a state of arousal or attention, being able to pay attention, where they can actually attend and process and respond to your language. And sometimes your language, maybe the task that you're asking them to do, is actually a trigger, right? I've used the example before about a child who has a lot of anxiety about handwriting. And it can be other things, but I'll use the handwriting example again, that you just tell them it's time for homework and bam, they escalate and they're not listening. And you're getting that threat response. And what we're saying is they're not listening. I told them to go do their homework and they're not doing it. But the reality is it's not that they're not listening. They're not being willful and oppositional. You told them to go do their homework and their nervous system went into fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And a lot of times it's that flight response where what's going on is they're avoiding the task. All right, so what do we do? What can we do to support a child in being able to cooperate, being able to listen? Well, there's a lot of good strategies. I'm going to go over a few and you can give them a try with your child and see if they work. One of the first things I like to do is check to see if the child is engaged. And what I mean by that is when I'm giving a verbal direction, is the child even with me? Are they connected? Or am I making mistakes like giving directions from across the room or trying to give directions to a child who's watching videos on their iPad? They're clearly engaged with the iPad. They're processing the language and the auditory input coming from the iPad. They are not processing the language coming from my voice that's across the room or maybe down on the first floor of my house. So some of the strategies that you can use in these cases are what I call attention securing strategies. You just got to get their engagement first. The number one strategy is proximity. Please do not give directions from across the room or yelling from the lower floors of your house up to the second floor. Go to your child, right? Go to your child and be close, be near them. Maybe touch them, right? Don't cause a startle response. Make sure they know you're there and respect their boundaries if they don't like touch, if they're oversensitive to the touch. But by all means, get near them, and sometimes a hand on their knee, a hand on the shoulder, something like that. Maybe combine visuals or only use visuals. If your child's strength is visual processing, then it makes sense to use visuals. And visuals can be something as fancy as like board maker picture schedules that are used for autistic children quite frequently, or it could be something as simple as the apple and the banana from your kitchen, and you're just asking, which snack do you want, the apple or the banana? And having the physical object there so that the child understands the choice and then can express their decision. Another way to secure attention is voice volume. So I use this a lot where I just whisper, right? I just whisper. And if you drop your voice down to a whisper, that very often gets their attention. Or maybe instead of a whisper, you're going to use a Donald Duck voice or some other kind of a silly voice. Maybe it's going to be a superhero voice or the Hulk, right? You're going to imitate the Hulk. And that kind of humorful change in your voice can secure their attention. Now, that doesn't mean that you're giving the direction in the silly voice necessarily, but sometimes that works really well. I usually use, like, for example, the whisper. I will use that just to secure their attention. And then once I have their attention, I might continue with the whisper. And it's really so much fun when they start whispering back, right? And then you know that they're very engaged and very paying attention. As you're using proximity and touch and visuals and voice volume, I want you to think about eye contact. Very often we require eye contact, but some children cannot process auditory information and visual information at the same time. So I'm going to ask you to be very cognizant of how your child seems to naturally want to listen. I had one wonderful little guy that I was working with in OT, and it was such a revelation to me. I used a whisper to get his attention. And then I said, "Are you listening?" And he responded by turning his ear towards my mouth and said, "Yes, I am." And then I let him stand like that sideways to me while I gave some instructions and made a request. And he followed through 100% accurate, just right away cooperated and did exactly what I asked. And what we discovered, his mom and I, was that that worked. Not demanding the eye contact, which, by the way, parents expected and wanted eye contact as a sign of respect, right? They thought that that was a way to show that he was paying attention and to show that he was respectful of his parents. But we just learned that it wasn't working for him. And so that was a big adjustment for these parents to not force the eye contact when they wanted him to follow directions or to listen, right? Right. And then the last thing to do about securing attention is to recognize processing time. So when you use an attention securing strategy, you need to give the child time to process that and shift their attention. And I'm going to call it selective interrupting. And I want you to think about yourself when you are, say, for example, texting or typing an email and someone interrupts you. Do you immediately stop in the middle of what you're doing and respond to the person who wants your attention? If it's an emergency, sure. But 9 out of 10 times, or maybe 95 out of 100, it's not an emergency. And so typically what we as adults would say is, hold on, hang on, let me finish this, and then I'll pay attention to you, right? We might not use those words, but that's what we mean. Wait a minute. And we very rarely, if at all, give our children the same benefit. So an example of this would be a child who is watching a video. I will very often say to that child, "Hey, I have a question," when you can pause your video. And then I wait and I let them hit pause. And then I know I have their attention and I didn't set up a power struggle and I didn't trigger them to get angry that they have to turn that off right now and stop right in the middle. That requires an amount of patience and reframing your own expectations in terms of how your child listens. All right. Other strategies that you can use to improve listening. Use less language. Now, this is a hard one for me. Very, very hard. But you absolutely can use less language. Fewer words, simpler words. Sometimes when children are bright and have big vocabularies, we as adults don't want to talk down to them, right? So we start using big words. But occasionally those children don't understand what our language means. They don't understand our words. So make sure you're using vocabulary that they do understand. And make sure that you're not using so much language that you overwhelm them. Less is more. I mentioned about using visuals to get their attention. You can also use visuals to supplement or complement the verbals. Again, pictures, objects, Maybe it's gestures or body language, physically pointing to where you want them to go or what you want them to do. Maybe it's your body language or a facial expression, maybe an exaggerated facial expression. Those things can all help with securing attention and improving the follow through. All right, the next thing you can do is to stop asking so many questions. Some of us as adults get in the habit of trying to be so respectful to our children, and I love that. Trying to give them a sense of autonomy and control, that we just give them too many questions. And by the end of the day, we as adults often suffer from what is called decision fatigue. We're just done. We don't want to make more decisions. We don't want any more either or. We don't want to decide where to go to dinner or what to make for dinner. We don't want to decide what to watch on TV. We're just done. Our kids get the same way. So if you're always phrasing your conversation or your directions as a question, think about how exhausting it might be for your child and try to shift your language to statements, right? Instead of saying, do you want to go to the park, and giving a choice, you could say, I think we should go to the park. That's a statement that allows your child to respond, I don't want to go, without forcing them to answer a question, right? It invites conversation, but it doesn't demand a response. There's a big difference there. And then another way to modify your language is to start using language like those statements that prompts a conversation or prompts the child to participate and engage. So, for example, you might start your sentence with, I wonder if you could go get your shoes, right? I need your help. How fast can you get ready so we're not late, right? Those kinds of phrases. I have a problem. I have a problem here. The garbage men come tomorrow and the trash is not out. So you're inviting the child with that kind of language to not only attend to what you're saying, but to feel some sense of agency and control. Okay. All right. The last thing I'm going to suggest as ways to improve listening is to practice co-regulation through connection. Well, last week's podcast was all about co-regulation. So hopefully that's still fresh on your mind if you listen to that one. And what this looks like when we're trying to get children to engage with us, to attend and follow through with that listening concept. What we want to do is to start by joining them where they're at. I worked with this amazing dad who came to a coaching session one time with this great story. And it was all about how his child was busy playing a video game and it was time for bed. And he had noticed in the past that when he would approach and say, hey, it's time for bed, she would react aggressively. She'd get angry. She'd scream and cry and have a meltdown. So he decided to try connecting first. And the success story goes like this. He went into the room and he sat down next to her where she was playing the video game. And he commented that it looked like a fun game, that she was having fun. And she said, yes. And then she said, but this is hard. This level is really hard. Can you help me do it? And this very clever dad took the opportunity to say, yeah, I'll help you get through this level. And then I think it's time we'll have to get ready for bed. So he helped her get through the level. And she was so excited and so happy They finished the level, and she said, it's time for bed, because she heard him say that it was time for bed. And he was just beside himself, so pleased with how it had worked. Now, I have said before when I'm mentioning strategies, I'm not guaranteeing that these strategies work 100% of the time. But with over the course of time, what it builds when you connect like that is it builds the connection, it builds the relationship, and it helps the child feel safe when you're asking them to make these transitions, sometimes transitions that are really, really hard. Another thing you can do, and what he could have done in that situation had she responded differently, right? Had she still responded aggressively, is that you respond, but you don't react, right? You don't push back on the child. Don't engage in the power struggle that the child is trying to start. It takes two to be in a power struggle, and you just need to back away from that. So in that situation, if she had said, no, I don't want to go to bed, like if she had already kind of anticipated that's where this is going, he could have just said, oh, I know. He could have just agreed, right? He could have gone back to some of those co-regulation strategies. He could have given her time to process what the demand is. And that's really important for this connection and listening. Using my favorite phrase, I wish the problem is, right? He could have said, I wish we could play video games all night. The problem is, it's time for bed. We need to get our sleep so we're ready for tomorrow. Or he could have said, the problem is, I can't wait to read this story to you when you go to bed, right? It's time for bed, and I've got this great book I want to read. The other thing you can do is something called fanciful wish granting. That's where you say, oh my gosh, I wish we could stay up all night playing video games. What would it be like if we stayed up all night long? Let's never go to bed, right? We make it humorous, and we engage the child's connection by sharing the joke and talking about how crazy it would be. Like, there's no way we can stay up all night. We'd get exhausted. We'd fall asleep, right? Everything would go dark. The doors would be locked, whatever, the lights are turned off, and maybe they'd have all kinds of ideas, and you could just agree with them. And, oh yeah, and maybe someday we'll do that. It doesn't mean you're agreeing that you're going to do it right now. The other thing you need to do is hold your boundaries, right? Again, we talked about this last week with co-regulation. It doesn't mean that you're getting, you're going to be a pushover parent. You're going to hold your boundaries, right? And you can set boundaries. Let's do it 3 times. Let's do 10 more repetitions. Let's do 1 more level. Set a timer, how many minutes. All those things can work to improve the listening, the follow through, the cooperation. As you're giving them time to process, hold space for those big feelings, right? You're going to practice holding space, letting your child express themselves. It's okay if they cry. They're sad. That's okay. Let them cry. You don't have to stop the crying. They can feel those feels. And, you don't have to fix that. That's important for them to feel it. And then if they're not, hopefully at a 5 out of 5, you can use regulating strategies, right? You can help them with sensory or movement-based activities. You can pick from your toolbox what seems to be appropriate in the moment, okay? So wrapping up, kind of, what are the key takeaways from this conversation? If we're trying to solve the problem of a child not listening, we need to do 4 things. We need to clarify what we actually mean by not listening, because by doing that, we're going to better understand the nature of the problem. Is it strong will and self-direction? Is it a skill deficit in executive function skills? Is it an issue with language or auditory processing or just hearing? Is it a motor planning, right? Translating language to movement or being able to plan and sequence and organize? Is it a limbic system response? Being able to determine what's going on in the moment is what's going to allow you to pick the right tool, right? So clarify what you mean by not listening, understand the why they're not listening, check your toolkit. What are your tools? I've given you a lot of them today. Attention securing strategies, modification of your language, and connecting for co-regulation. Choose those from those strategies or any others that you have in your toolkit right now, using logic and rationale and pulling on your child's strengths. And then as the adult, stay empowered, feel really empowered to stay regulated yourself and choose the appropriate tool for the moment. What is going to work right now, right? Make your best choice. It's just a hypothesis. Sometimes it's trial and error. Please don't give up. You have to practice these strategies over and over. And as you go, as you practice problem solving effectively, your competency and your confidence will continue to grow because you're going to start to see what strategies work and what strategies don't. And the more you clarify, what are you really looking at? What do you really mean? And what is your child's behavior really telling you? The better you're going to be at problem solving, right? You'll start thinking like I do, like an OT, right? And you'll start being able to select the right tool for the moment. All right, that's it for today. That was a lot. I hope if you didn't get it all, you'll go back, do a replay, take some notes, try some of those strategies. If you try some, drop me a note. You can email me directly. It's Deborah, Debra, at steps4development.com. You can DM me on social media. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram. If you're not already following me, please do so and maybe share the link with family and friends if you want them to learn some of the same information. If you know educators, maybe your child's teacher or somebody at the daycare center who would benefit from my approach and what I'm sharing here, please, by all means, share the podcast and help more people get connected so that we can all help the kids we love to be successful and grow into the best that they can be. All right. Thanks for joining me today. And I hope to see you again soon. So bye for now.